God has given marriage as a gift, but he has also given singleness as a gift. And some people have read this and they've thought to themselves, okay, so does this mean that there are some people who are gifted with singleness and they're just going to be single for the rest of their life? Well, Jesus did say something that seemed to support this idea. So he was teaching, and he starts teaching on divorce and remarriage, and he was talking to his disciples, and he basically says that they shouldn't consider divorce. And so they said this to him, they said, well, if that's the case, then it's better not to marry. They say this in Matthew 19:10. And Jesus responds to them by saying, not everyone can accept this statement, only those whom God helps. Some are born as eunuchs, some have been made eunuchs by others, some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So there are some who would say that God gives a gift of singleness to people, and they're just supposed to stay single for the rest of their lives. And while that may be true for some, I think we need to understand that even if it's not the case that God is going to have you remain single for the rest of your life, times of singleness, the time when you are single, is still a gift from God, whether you eventually marry or not. Go back to 1 Corinthians 7 with me and look at verse 8. It says, so I say to those who aren't married and to widows, it is better to stay unmarried just as I am. So Paul not only says that singleness is a gift, he also says to those who aren't married and to widows that he thinks it's better for them to stay unmarried. Now, why would he write this to this church in Corinth? Well, again, some people might think that this looks like a command from God to avoid marriage, but I don't think that's what this is. Marriage is something created by God, like I said, for our good. Both singleness and marriage are gifts. He continues on, he says, but if they can't control themselves, they should go ahead and get married. Now, it's better to marry than to burn with lust. Now, I feel like I need to be clear on this here. Marriage is not a quick fix for those who struggle with lust. I've had friends who've looked at these verses and have told me, I know that God has not called me to be single for the rest of my life because I actually struggle with lust. And so obviously, I look at this verse, Paul says it's better to marry than to burn with lust. So God obviously just wants me to hurry up and get married. And I've had several of those friends walk into their marriages and their sin issue that they struggled with wasn't fixed by their marriage. Jesus fixes our sin issue. We have to look to him for that. But Paul is saying here, he's encouraging them that, yeah, there's a lot of sexual immorality around you. It's better to be in a marriage that honors God the way God designed it than to sin against him in ways he's commanded us not to. And honestly, for me, there have been times when I've struggled with lust. And the first time I read this verse, I went to that thought of, well, what if God just gave me a wife so this would be fixed? And God had to walk me through and show me that that's not the solution to solving my sin problem. Like we heard today with Ashley's story, Jesus is the solution to our sin problems. He's the one who washes us clean. That's what the picture of baptism is about. And so when we're struggling with sin issues, we can't look to things other than Jesus to solve them. We need to rely on him and trust in his salvation ultimately. And yes, work and try to be better followers of him in our sin struggles, but ultimately look to him for the strength to overcome our struggles. It's not that we're going to get married one day and snap our fingers and our problems will be solved. Now, all of these things kind of were diving into my head as I'm going through this passage and I'm trying to figure out why is it that I'm in this season of singleness. And I just was struck by the fact that if marriage isn't the solution to this issue, well then marriage obviously isn't the solution to my feelings of social isolation that I went through. Marriage isn't the solution to my feelings of instability. Now, marriage brings good things, but ultimately I need to look to God to be the source of those things that I felt like I was struggling with. And as we go on, Paul gives a specific command to married people whose spouses are unbelieving in verse 10. And then he contrasts this down further in verse 12 where he says, now I will speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. And he gives instructions, then that's where he gives instruction to people who are married, but their spouses don't follow Jesus. And so as I was looking at this and I was looking at what Paul said earlier, I was really struggling through this passage. And I'm like, okay, so is Paul saying here that this desire of his that many stay single, is that coming from him or is that coming from God? Well, I think with what Jesus says in Matthew and what Paul's saying here, God is reminding us that it's important as we go through these seasons of our life, when we face singleness, that we steward well, we be good managers well of the different relationships we have. Because God encourages people to be in relationship with one another. We're designed to be in relationship with one another. And so I think this is something that Paul is explaining, that God has a gift for us in our seasons of singleness. If you are someone like me who is going through a time where you're single, God has a lesson to teach you in that. Jesus says, let anyone accept this who can. God has a gift for us in the time of singleness, which is the lessons we learn by following Jesus more. And this is supported further on down as Paul continues on. If you look with me at verse 17, he says, each of you should continue to live in whichever situation God has placed you. Remain as you were when God first called you. This is my rule for all the churches. Now, Paul is not saying here that we need to be trapped in the circumstances that we were saved out of, but to be content with what God has given us. For those who are single, it can often be a real struggle with this idea of contentment. And so as I was looking at this, I had to ask myself, well, what does it really mean to be content? What does it mean to live in the situation God has given me? And that's where I came down to this idea that I need to make sure that I am stewarding. Again, that's an older word. It just means like managing well all the relationships that God has given me. We need to manage well our friendships. We need to manage well, if you're married, your relationship with your spouse. God has given us the relationships in our life as a gift. The same way he's given us marriage and singleness as a gift, he's given us the gift of friends. And God does not want us to be alone. Our feelings of self-isolation that oftentimes single people struggle with. I have found joy in spending time with close friends who point me towards Jesus. And I've found the more that I understand that I need to be content with what God has given me, the better I'm able to do this, to steward, to manage well the different relationships God has given me. Paul goes on and he explains in verse 20, he kind of gives a picture about why it is that we're not supposed to be trapped in our circumstances, but what it really means to kind of be content. Because contentment is more than just being complacent. Paul says in verse 20, yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you. But if you get a chance to be free, take it. So again, Paul doesn't want his readers to think that they're stuck in their situations. He wants them to see their situations that they've been given, whether they seem good or bad to them, as blessings from God. Oftentimes, people who are in a season of singleness see it the way I saw it. They don't see it for the blessing God intended it to be. And in a similar way to someone who is in slavery when they're saved, and they could think to themselves, well, God's placed me in this difficult situation. How am I to serve him in this? I think we need to take Paul's words to heart. And like he said to the slave, I think if there's not permanent, if singleness isn't something God has for you permanently, then don't wait to pursue what God has for you. And Paul later on in this chapter is going to address some of the particular blessings that come from being unmarried, from being single. If you look down with me at verse 32, it says, I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking about how to please him. This is so different from what our culture says times of singleness should be like, right? Our culture says being single is all about me. I'm going to take my extra time and I'm going to either pour into my career, I'm going to make more money, or I'm going to have some kind of thriving social life. But Paul says, no, if you're unmarried, if you're single, it's not about you. You have an opportunity here. You have the blessing of extra time to give back to Jesus, to give back to the one who saved you, to give back to the one who ultimately needs to be the one to satisfy your needs. And so Paul points out that singleness offers this unique opportunity to focus our devotion to our most important relationship, to our relationship with God. He's not saying that singleness is just inherently better or that you must stay single if you're single. He's saying that people who are single have this blessing, they have this opportunity. Look down with what he says in verse 35. He kind of wraps up all of the things he's been saying with this. I'm saying this for your benefit, not to place restrictions on you. I want you to do whatever will help you serve the Lord best with as few distractions as possible. Paul wants people to be devoted to Jesus above all, to be content. And Paul knows that as followers of Jesus, if we want to see people in seasons of singleness, if we ourselves are in a season of singleness and we want to not just survive it, but we want to truly thrive in it, if we want to be a good friend to those around us, then we need to understand that God ultimately wants us to be satisfied in him. Like I said before, those feelings that can come up where we feel like often as single people we're inadequate, or even sometimes when you're married, you can struggle with the same thing. You can feel inadequate, or you have times in your life when you're struggling with feelings of depression or feelings of dissatisfaction within our relationships. God ultimately wants us to be satisfied in him. This is true for married people just as much as it is for single people. Our ultimate satisfaction, our ultimate feeling of being a complete person cannot come from any person. It can only come from God. Paul wrote this about being content in Philippians chapter 4. He says, not that I was ever in need, for I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. I'll confess, as I've been going through this time of singleness, this is a scripture that I've had to wrestle with as well. It's come to me and I don't feel content. I've felt like I haven't been serving God at times to my fullest because I haven't found my contentment in him. But luckily, God provides us the space to go back to him and be filled. God allows us to come back to him and find that satisfaction in him again, to return to our first love, the most important relationship in our lives. And when you're feeling isolated and alone, whether you're single or not, I would just remind you, God created us to be in relationships. When I first started coming to Berean, I took advantage of connect groups, and I joined a connect group. And I'll be honest, as someone who is single, it was a little awkward at first being in a connect group with all married people. I was the only single person in my group. I even remember there was one night, and I love that they did this. They went around the table and they shared the story of how they proposed to their spouse. And I kind of got to me, and I did feel a little awkward in that moment. I did share the story of watching my sister get proposed to, because that was the closest I have to a proposal story right now. But it was really through that connect group and building relationships there, even though there were times where it felt awkward, where I really started to see, it was a time again where I was kind of struggling with discontentment, and I started to be filled again by coming along people who were showing me satisfaction in God ultimately. I was reminded of how important it was for me to do that. And I would just encourage you, if you're married and you want to reach out to a friend who's single, a big part of why I felt so able to adapt to that connect group is because there was one week we didn't meet, and the host family who'd been hosting the group, they just invited me to come over to dinner anyways. And even though I'd been feeling a little awkward about the group, again, being the only single guy there was a little awkward at first, just that time around the table with that one family kind of broke the ice for me and helped me feel more connected to that group. We often talk about being a faith family. I felt adopted by my Connect group in a lot of ways. And that was a huge help to me. And it still is. That's why I'm still in a Connect group. I know that I need to build relationships in my life that help me follow Jesus. I need to manage those relationships well, steward them well. Like I said, look for people who will encourage me to find my satisfaction in Jesus, to find my satisfaction, my ultimate feeling of completeness, not in a relationship with a person, but in my relationship with God. I have another just encouragement. If you are single and you're struggling, don't wait to seek out relationships with Jesus followers who will push you towards him more. It's something I've seen where a lot of my friends who have been single, because there is that sense of awkwardness, they hold themselves back from seeking out those relationships. I would just encourage you, if that's you, please don't. Because God did create us to be in relationships. And the cool thing is that while it can seem like there's a tension there between the fact that God created us to be in relationships and he wants us to be satisfied in him, those two ideas, they're not mutually exclusive. Just like the gift of singleness, God gives us the gifts of relationships because ultimately he wants us to remember that everything good comes from him. He is the blessing in our lives. I truly believe that if we embrace the reality that God wants us to be satisfied in him, and if we understand that no human person can hold the relationship that we hold with God, if we embrace that in our own lives and pour that out into others, we encourage our friends who are struggling relationally, whether they're single or not, that God is the ultimate answer to their relationship struggles, we will see God draw closer to people. We will see people draw closer to God and God draw closer to people.